Clint Betts. Oh, well, you know what? I love Provo. So what a privilege to be back in the motherland, as it were.
Provo was popping on Saturday night. See that?
Yeah, I was jealous. My
crazy?
daughter was at the game. I was not, but it looked like maybe I have the most FOMO I've ever had in my entire life.
Like the greatest BYU game ever.
It's crazy.
That was wild, dude. Oh my god!
And with the new stadium lights and, you know, Cosmo doing a backflip with 70-pound weights, it was just crazy.
Cosmo's wild.
Yeah.
Cosmo's always been like, we have good mascots for some reason. You know, like these really good in Utah, like Cosmo and the Jazz Bear.
Yeah.
They kind of like take it to the extremes. Yeah. Which is pretty wild. I wonder what that is.
I don't know.
Must be something in the water.
Yeah, it is. Is it this water? Is it Silicon Slopes water that does that?
I think it's the Silicon Slopes water. I think it's the Silicon Slopes Fiji water with us just wrapping our brand around it. Fiji doesn't pay us, man. You know?
They should.
They should pay
Why
us.
Not? Silicon Slopes on co-brand. That's what you got to do if you want their money.
If they paid us, I would take this off.
Yeah.
We ready, Wesson? I want to talk to you about all sorts of things, man. But let's start with, I would like to introduce you to our community. You might be a little bit of unknown in the Silicon Slopes community directly, right? You're very well known in the state of Utah in general. So how did you get started? What did you go to school for? Tell me about Burke Olsen.
Yeah. Okay. I thought I was going to be a PR guy, and I was for the first sort of part of my career. My dad had studied journalism at BYU, hoping that he'd go into PR. I studied PR and eventually made the turn to the dark side, as I call it, of journalism. And so I started out working in PR jobs at BYU as a tour guide first, and then in university communications. And I had a job at the Marriott School at BYU. And then I moved to, well, actually, the coolest part of my early career was I had interned at a PR firm. The Salt Lake offices of a New York-based firm called Coltrane and Associates. And they are the ones who won the Olympic bid post-scandal. And the president of Coltrane, this great guy, now deceased, but named Steve Coltrane, one of the best media strategists I've ever encountered, said, Burke, you ought to leave BYU and come work for me full-time, and you can work on the Olympic account. So I did. I left before graduating and spent time with the Salt Lake Organizing Committee. I was embedded. I had a cubicle there and got to travel with Caroline Shaw, who was the chief communications officer, to Greece to pick up the Olympic flame and bring it back to Atlanta, where we kicked off the torch relay, and then was on the road for part of that time with the Olympic torch relay. So that was a great experience. Then I went back to BYU, finished there, moved to Washington, D.C. without a job, started graduate school at Johns Hopkins, and then got a job at a boutique PR firm called Susan Davis International. And there we did things like the dedication of the National World War II Memorial, which was awesome. Have all these World War II, the greatest generation people assembled on the National Mall for the dedication of that monument. And then a vice president there, a guy named Derek LaValle. This will be the first time I've ever told this story publicly because Derek didn't want me to tell it initially.
Silicon Slopes Summit is Utah's original and longest-running grassroots tech event. It provides entrepreneurs, startups, and leaders the resources and community they need to succeed. With the pandemic behind us, we're excited to bring Silicon Slopes Summit back to its original January dates in conjunction with the Sundance Film Festival. We have some unbelievable news. Silicon Slopes Summit is free for all Utahns for the first time ever. You heard that right. Silicon Slopes Summit is now free. For those looking for an upgraded experience, we are also offering VIP tickets for just $95. Thanks to our partners, sponsors, and government leaders, Silicon Slopes Summit is the most accessible tech and startup event in the world. Summit will be hosted in multiple locations throughout the week in both Utah and Salt Lake Valley. There will also be a Startup Alley at Summit this year, where startups and entrepreneurs can meet with investors from around the world to pitch their ideas, receive feedback, and promote what they're building. Of course, we'll be bringing in world-class leaders and speakers, as we have in the past, but we'll also be hosting specific tracks and bringing attendees together for curated networking in a way never done before. You don't want to miss this year's summit. To register, buy VIP tickets, learn about sponsorship, and apply for your startup to be part of Startup Alley. Go to siliconslopes.com/summit.
Derek had worked in the White House with Vice President Gore. And you had people, this was the owner of the firm, Susan Davis, was Republican. She had Democrats who worked for, and they did a lot of work for government agencies, a lot of DC sort of work. We did work for the Department of Health and Human Services. And Derek came to me and he said, Burke, I got a tip about a cool job that you'd be perfect for. He said, you just can't tell anybody in the firm that the recommendation came from me. So I got this email forwarded to me, and I applied for a job at a place called the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. It was a project of the Pew Research Center. And I went there. I had this great interview with this woman named Sandy Stencil, who became one of my great mentors in life and in work. And she said, first question, and for anybody who grew up in Utah, went to school in Utah, this is a question that you think it's going to go one way, it went a different way. But she said, you're from Utah, I see. Can I ask you a question about that? And I'm ready, because we've all had those questions.
Yeah.
We know what those are like, the horns or whatever else. And
How many wives do you have?
exactly.
Those types of things.
Yeah. I had none at the time. Gotten up to one by now. But I said, yeah, you can ask your question. She said, do you love Park City as much as I do? I was so relieved. Yes, I do love Park City. Park City's the best. So she and I bonded over Park City, and I got a job offer. And this really changed the trajectory of my career in so many ways. Went to work at the Pew Research Center. Had a great experience there for 3 years. And interestingly enough, I got involved in something there that would pay benefits later on in my career. I didn't know about product work. I didn't know about how you worked on the web. I just thought, the web is like this thing that we all have to make sure that our organizations look good on and tell good stories on and so forth. So at Pew, I oversaw an entire redesign of a website that we had at the time, pewforum.org. And I really liked that. I found great fulfillment because it took those PR skills combined with technology understanding and empathy for a user and integrating with the latest technology. That was a great experience. And then I went down to Southern Virginia University, which was the sort of upstart liberal arts college down in rural Virginia. And I was there for 5.5 years, leading public relations initially, and then marketing and communications, serving on the President's Leadership Council and trying to lure students from all over the country to come and try sort of an untested and early on an unaccredited university. And then it was there that I met a man named Paul Edwards. He was the provost, the chief academic officer at Southern Virginia. And he took a job at the Deseret News as the opinion editor. And then a short time later was made editor of the Deseret News. And he kept trying to convince me to leave what we were doing in Virginia. And it wasn't the right time. And then the next time around, it sort of was the right time. So that's almost 12 years ago now that I made that transition to news.
What was your first job inside the Deseret News?
I was the content director for DeseretNews.com.
Okay.
So I was overseeing a team of non-journalists, okay? And this was, Clark Gilbert was the head of the Deseret News at the time. He, of course, was...
You're mentioning Utah legends, by the way. Paul Edwards, Clark Gilbert. These guys are legends.
These are guys, yeah.
Great men.
Absolutely, they are. Clark was a student of Clayton Christensen at Harvard and then went on to become business partners with him. And so when you talk about disruptive innovation, Clayton Christensen, famous worldwide for that. And Clark was his devotee, right? His student and maybe even, a prodigy of his. And Clark came and disrupted the Deseret News. The first thing he did was laid off 45% of the staff, which was a terrible day. People who live there or who were there at that time still feel bad about that. You have survivor's guilt when something like that happens. But Clark made a big change and split up the company and had digital teams run entirely independently of the print newspaper and print operations. And so I was running the content for that digital disruptive part where we were growing audience, looking at analytics, redesigning the website and creating a digital experience that was far surpassing anything in terms of reach that we'd ever done as a newspaper before that.
Yeah. And at what point were you like, I really like this? This is really fun. Was it from right at the beginning?
I think it was the beginning. Although, it's a coming from a world where it's hard to measure the impact of what you're doing to a world where you can see right now on a big screen in the newsroom, did that social push really get more people to the site? Did that newsletter drive more people? That was a little bit daunting to be immediately accountable for the decisions that we were making.
You're just checking chart beat constantly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. That's where we were spending our time. So yeah, a good transition, but I've definitely liked it. After that, I became the general manager. My boss left, a great product mind named Chris Higbee left, and they promoted me to be the general manager. So then I had the content people direct reporting to me. And then for the first time, I had product and software engineering reporting to me as well. And then I did that for a while and then became the head digital officer. And ultimately, Clark had left and we didn't know how long the disruptive team had to exist independent of the journalists.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started lobbying to say, let me bring the digital team over to the newspaper team and start infusing some of that digital DNA. One of the transitions that the entire news industry has had to make, and we were making at that time, and it's a little pithy statement, but we'll sometimes say your job is not to write, it's to be read. And there's a big difference. When you're a journalist and you're again, they were taking accountability based on instant analytics now, the same way that my team was earlier. And you think your job is done when you hit enter and publish something in the CMS. But we're trying to say, no, you've got to find out, did you write this for an audience? Did you get this in front of the audience? And how did they respond afterwards? And then when you figure out that something works, a certain line of thinking, a way of framing a story, then you return to that well again and again and again. It turns out the audience will follow you when you do that.
Mm-hmm. That is super interesting. Okay, so I have tons of questions for you. One, by the way, congratulations. You were just announced to be on the board of Pew, right? Like you're coming back.
Yeah.
That's incredible. Like that was just like last week I saw something like that. So congratulations on that. That's full circle. That's incredible. What an honor.
It's exactly full circle. Yeah. I could have never imagined that would happen. Let me tell you something interesting about that, because I think it plays into why Utah is special and how we're seen differently. Mike Dimmick, who's the president of Pew Research Center, he worked there when I was there and has worked his way up, and he's doing a fantastic job. He and I were talking about audience strategy. He had me out to speak to his staff last year and had a Q&A session in front of his staff. It was absolutely delightful. And for them, I was the media who's their target audience. So they were listening to every word. I sort of wasn't used to people caring that much about what I said, but they really cared about what I said. And we publish a lot about Pew Research Center studies. Our journalists are very focused on the strong research that they do. But we were having this call about audience strategy, and he said, Burke, could you hang on for 2 more minutes? He said, I have a vacancy opening up on my board. Is there any chance that you'd be willing to do that? And my chin hit the, what? What are you talking about? I don't feel remotely qualified. And the good news is he doesn't think I'm qualified to weigh in on opinion research, right? I don't have the credentials for that. That's not what he's looking for. But he's looking for 2 things. One is what he called geographic diversity. Most of their people are coastal elites, which is great. And that's exactly the kind of people that you want. But he's realized that in terms of true diversity on his board, he didn't have somebody from middle America. And probably he assumes, and rightly so, I probably have a little bit of ideological diversity from the other people on that board, which is great. I believe in that kind of ideological diversity. And then also audience strategy. They're thinking, how do you grow audience? And we've had tremendous success being the little pioneer founded in 1850 Deseret News.
Longest running business in the state of Utah.
That's exactly right.
In Utah's history is the Deseret News.
And we're still the largest news organization, but we're punching above our weight in terms of how many people we're reaching outside of the state. And he thinks if Deseret News is the little engine that could, well, maybe the Pew Research Center has something that they could learn from us. And so I look forward to learning more from the fellow board members and making a contribution.
Oh, not only do I think they can learn a lot from you, I think the New York Times could. I think the biggest newspapers in the world could. I mean, what has happened at the Deseret News and with Deseret, is it Deseret Digital Media Company? Is that what it's all inside of now, or whatever it is?
The parent company is Deseret Management Corporation.
Deseret Management Corporation. Yeah. Okay, so I am blown away by Deseret Management Corporation. I am blown away by the foresight, particularly on KSL.com, to understand like, hey, advertising is going to go away as a revenue model. So we need to figure out other strategies in order to do that. And the jobs board and the classifieds and the cars and the homes and all that type of stuff, and owning that. Like Craigslist doesn't exist in the state of Utah. It's like KSL. That's right. There's no Facebook marketplace. I'm never on Facebook, so I'm saying this without actually knowing. But I don't get the sense that Facebook's that dominant either. It feels like KSL is where you go to sell things. Like, I mean, that is just that alone, to have that foresight. And by the way, like, yeah, obvious now in 2024, almost 2025, not obvious. How long has that been happening? That's been for a long time.
The guy who put classifieds online at KSL.com was named Russell Bands. He was a boss of mine at Deseret Digital Media early on. Russell was started as the webmaster of KSL, I think in like 1996. He came in, he said, "You guys need a webmaster. I think that's me." So he came in, and the story goes that he went to maybe the CFO and he said, I need $1,000 to buy a piece of software to put free online classifieds on KSL. Now at the time, Russell was thinking, I'll put the Tribune and the Deseret News out of business, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's like, and we'll get more traffic to KSL.com. And I don't know who that finance guy was. And if he's listening to this, he can seek me out. I'm not hard to find online. But the story goes that he said, "Russell, you're an idiot. You'll never make that money back." And of course, that was the creation of KSL Classifieds. So first to market before Craigslist. And when I tell people outside of this market, and I talk to a lot of media executives from all over the country and all over the world, that we beat Craigslist and it's virtually non-existent, they can't believe it.
Yeah.
And what's great for me is, that revenue doesn't come directly to the Deseret News anymore, but it's still in our building. And it's still, frankly, a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
And interestingly enough, KSL.com is the most successful local broadcast website in the country. There's nobody who has what they have. So you have this great interplay between people who come for news and stay to look at F-150s, or people who come and they're looking for skis, but decide that they're going to read a couple news stories on the side. So
what do you make of that? Why is that true? Why is KSL.com so successful?
So it's the classifieds. It's the simplicity of the product. There are a lot of product decisions that you can make in news, a lot of bells and whistles. But if you use the KSL app, which hundreds of thousands of Utahns do, or go to the KSL website every day, it's, a few highlighted stories and a very simple queue. So at a glance, you see what's going on. That I think meets a basic user need. If you want to stay updated on what's happening in the Beehive State, KSL.com is the place to go. Add to that, they've had access for now almost 2 decades to Deseret News photography. A local TV station doesn't have access to good photography in most every market in the US. We have fantastic photographers at the Deseret News. We make all of our photography available to them. And then we have some content sharing back and forth between KSL.com to Deseret.com and vice versa. And so all of that comes together to meet user needs, elevate the experience. And again, if you want breaking news on what's happening in Utah today, KSL.com is a great place to start and end your day.
You know what's interesting about KSL, as you were saying that, I actually forget that it's also a TV station.
Right.
And it's also a radio.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, because I can't even imagine looking at that. Like, but not to criticize. I just don't ever I don't know what that's like. Right. Like, I remember I've actually been on one of the shows, KSL shows. I can't remember why or for whatever, maybe to promote Summit or something like that. And I was like, this is wild that this thing still exists. Yeah. How long does that still keep going? And what is that like? I mean, is that successful? It must be.
It is successful. KSL TV, very successful, dominant in this market. The radio station still is a part of people's daily lives, whether they're driving or tuning in to listen to BYU sports or to a Jazz game. It's still really important.
There you go. You do Jazz games and you do sports and you do those types of things.
Sports is a huge draw. And then not only that, but the success of KSL as a media broadcasting entity is replicated by radio stations that we own in markets throughout the West. So we have radio stations in Sacramento, Phoenix, Denver, Seattle, Los Angeles. And you'll have 2 or 3 radio stations in a market. So you can cover sports and talk radio and, easy listening at the same time. And then a sales force goes out and says, we can reach, 90% of the target demographic through radio. And there are still so many listeners to radio that ends up being really lucrative if you do it in the right way.
I don't know if you know this, but I actually had a show on KSL, and it was the Deseret News Silicon Slopes Hour.
This. Yeah.
And I think it aired on Sunday morning. Again, I don't really know what happened because I never listened to it live once. But we would go in there and do recordings. It was actually way fun, and it was cool.
Well, and look at you now.
Let's put this back on there, man. That'd be great. So KSL.com does this incredible thing, incredible revenue generator. Now, the interesting piece about what KSL.com does, and its role in the community, because it really is like a gathering place. It's a place of commerce. It's all that type of stuff. And it's a place of information, right? The interesting piece of this is now information is so politicized. News is so politicized. Journalism is like, I can't think of a profession. Everybody's profession and their popularity rating has like gone down significantly over the past decade. But in particular, for some reason, journalism has been hit the worst. Maybe not for some reason. I think we could probably explain it. But so when you're a gathering place, a place of commerce, a place of information, and you have to cover things in a certain way, how does that work? And how do you toe that line of like, we want to, because to me, like, it should be like, it's kind of right down the middle. It's, like, we're just, here's everything that's happening in the world that, or in Utah and these types of things. And also like sell your car here or, or sell whatever you want here. You have like this interesting role, because if you write something on the content side that dissuades people from selling on the other side, or maybe there's a wall. I don't know. Tell me how you think about that.
I think that's an astute question, because people are looking for signs of media bias, right? And I'm not involved in the day-to-day operations of KSL.com, so I can't tell you about the complaints that they get.
Sure.
But I can tell you what we get at the Deseret News, which is on a daily basis, we get complaints from people on the left who say that we're freak out conservatives. And you'll get complaints from people on the right that say we're lefty, liberal, progressive, going to H, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's actually good that we are, I take that as a badge of courage a little bit, that we get criticized from both sides. But here's the challenge of a modern news organization who's trying to be objective, right? And objectivity, we could talk about whether or not that's possible. But a lot of news organizations and a lot of journalists get a lot of attention online for fear-mongering. Read this, because these are the terrible things that are going to happen if this person becomes president or becomes senator, becomes governor. And that's a cheap trick, but it drives clicks and it drives attention. And when you're trying to live above that fray, it's a little bit harder. And in fact, our growth was rapid for a period of time, and it's sort of slowing down a little bit right now because we're not playing those games. We are, though, I'll say, in a portfolio strategy. If you think about, if you're a very small media conglomerate, there are media conglomerates that own hundreds of radio stations and dozens of newspapers. So we're small, but steady. In your portfolio strategy, if you have a KSL.com that is the most successful news website in the state of Utah, right?
Yeah.
Like KSL.com, with our help, has beat not only the Deseret News, but the Salt Lake Tribune for local media coverage. They just have. That exists. Well, that gives us an opportunity then as Deseret to look outside the borders of Utah. In fact, I love, if you've ever seen a map of what Brigham Young intended the state of Deseret to look like, it was huge. It went to San Francisco.
Oh, yeah.
It took in all the Western states. So we take that as actually, if we're looking outside of Utah, let's start by looking out at the West. We think there are unique enough things happening here. The success of entrepreneurship in Utah, we're the top list of so many national studies and trends and polls. You know all about that. You talk about this on the show all the time.
Sure.
But we think Utah is unique enough that we have something to teach the rest of the nation, that our perspective matters, our ability to solve problems, to come together and work with people across the aisle to solve really tricky problems. We think that's a model not only for other states in the West, but for states throughout the country. And that's where we're concentrating. That's where our audience growth is outside of Utah. We have a great core here, but we see a lot of room for growth around the country. And we're going to do it trying to walk this higher road.
Yeah. And by the way, okay, enough about KSL.com. Let's get to Deseret News, because I love everything about it. But yeah, I'm just so impressed with KSL.com. I can't even believe that story. And I think that'll be studied. If it's not already studied in Harvard Business School, it should be.
Yeah.
Because that thing is crazy. The way that there's no other place, there's no other site or thing like it in the entire country. That is wild. It's just crazy. Freaks me out, actually. But let's get to Deseret News. Okay, so Deseret News is this interesting challenge, I imagine, for you. And KSL is this too, but at the same time, for some reason, KSL is not tainted with this as much and not tainted in a good way and a bad way. And who owns it?
Yeah.
Right? And it's owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints through a number. I don't really know how it works, but it's at the end of the day, it's owned by the church, right? which is, again, puts you in this really interesting position as somebody who's leading a publication with a institution that clearly has a point of view on the world, not a political point of view per se, but a point of view on the world and how you should live your life and all those types of things. What is that like? What is it like being owned? And by the way, everybody's owned by somebody.
Yeah. Everybody has an owner.
I'd much rather be owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints than probably anybody, if I'm being honest here. So it's much better than Jeff Bezos or somebody, or, the New York Times family that just keeps going over and over. So these things cost a lot of money. In fact, they probably lose money, which I want to ask you about. But what's it like being how do you think about that? And I think it has obviously affected the mission of Deseret News, where the focus is less about the divisive issues, it seems to me, and more about faith and family. It's like the only publication I can think of that reports on faith and those types of things. Anyways.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you, I'm proud every day that we're owned by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I've never been ashamed of it. I'm never upset about it. It never causes me concern. In fact, it gives me great pride that a church invests in the local community the way that it does, and also looking nationally and internationally. As you said, everybody has an owner. When we have journalists who come to the Deseret News, if I'm interviewing them, I'll always ask them first, how do you feel about working for an organization that's owned by this church? And then we have a good conversation. And often they want to know, well, I want to know that my reporting will be independent. And I talk about Jeff Bezos owning the Washington Post. Do they cover Bezos and Amazon and Bezos' super yacht and all those things? Yeah, they cover that. But their job isn't to be a watchdog on society protecting it from Jeff Bezos, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not trying to go through his garbage cans and reveal his spending habits. A lot of his spending habits you can see, they're publicly known. You know what he's spending money on. John Henry bought the Boston Globe because he wanted more coverage of the Boston Red Sox. Guess what they spend time covering?
Yeah, it's actually genius.
Something that he cares about. ABC owns, or Disney owns ABC. So guess what ABC isn't doing to Disney? Do they cover it? Yeah. Do they cover prices of the parks and success of the movies and those kinds of things? They do. But again, they're not trying to take it down. So we're freed from the burden of having to be a watchdog on the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Mm-hmm.
There are other news organizations that think that that's their job to do that. But what it does free us to do then is to look at faith, and especially religious liberty. This is not just because the church has an interest in protecting its own interests, but because from the founding of the church, Joseph Smith allowed leaders of other religions to preach in temples that he was building. It was ecumenical from the very beginning. And
Mm-hmm.
we do the same thing. We want religious liberty, religious freedoms to be protected, or the church does. And it follows that that's something that we spend an awful lot of time on. We've got the leading newsletter on faith and law at the Deseret News. It's called State of Faith. And it's by Kelsey Dallas, not a Latter-day Saint, who covers the Supreme Court, laws, legislation, things that are going to affect the free exercise of religion. And it has a smaller base, but those people are every religion journalist in the country subscribes to that newsletter. Policy people in Washington, D.C. and in each state capital subscribe to that newsletter. So we're reaching exactly who we want to with that kind of coverage. So yeah, church ownership, not a liability. And what's interesting, we think in Utah, people think that we're under the thumb of the church in some way, that we're not independent. But when I'm talking to media executives outside of Utah, they're jealous of our ownership because we're viewed as very much an independent media organization that isn't owned by some giant conglomerate that's only cares about the bottom line. They're really impressed and I think honestly jealous of the freedoms that we have as a news organization.
Oh, they should be. And there's we know who's going to own it in 10 years.
Right.
In 20 years, in 30 years, which you don't know for any of these other media entities, particularly in this environment. So that alone makes it incredible. And what an investment in Utah. I'll never really understand this idea you have to be a watchdog of certain things. I think you should tell true stories, right? And whatever happens from there, just do it. I never get the going through the trash can stuff. I don't actually think that's journalism. That seems like something else. But maybe I could be completely wrong. I don't know. So I was on the board of the Salt Lake Tribune, the inaugural board, actually, when they became a nonprofit, when Paul Huntsman was still chair and all of that type of stuff. And that's obviously an interesting relationship and an interesting competitor, I guess, or another player in the market that is obviously, they see their whole goal is probably like to be watchdogs of the church, and obviously very left leaning. Even when I was there, it was very left leaning, which is fine. I don't think it matters. But how do you think about your relationship with them and the fact that they were founded literally like as an anti-Mormon publication?
Yeah, they're founded as the Mormon Tribune by some disaffected members.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a long history there, but for the last 60 years, we were business partners in what's called a joint operating agreement. It's an exception to antitrust policy where we were allowed to collude on printing and advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Those two operations were jointly owned. So you've heard of the Newspaper Agency Corporation or the Utah Media Group. These were iterations of businesses that we jointly owned with the Tribune, and had a share based on the percentage of ownership. For the bulk of that time, the Tribune had the larger share of ownership. And then again, something Clark Gilbert did was switched that and made it so we were the majority shareholder in the organization. So we only dissolved that, I think, at the end of 2020.
Yeah, I think I was there. I think I was on the board when that was.
Yeah, it's when the daily newspaper went away.
Yeah.
And so we sold the printing press and the building and the operations. We divided up sort of the assets according to the share of the organization. And so we're no longer business partners. I can say the Tribune, I think, is trying to fulfill some needed gaps in the market. They certainly do a lot of reporting about the church. Some of it I don't think is fair. I'll give you an example, and I wasn't going to go here, and I may regret this later. But one of the things that is just a bit of a frustration for me with the Tribune, news organizations tend to be very careful about representing an organization according to the way that they, or a person, by the terms that they want to be recognized by. And I still feel that the Tribune goes out of their way not to use the full name of the church in a variety of places where it doesn't matter. I understand the argument if you're printing a newspaper, it's hard to put the name of a very large title for a church in a headline. I sort of get that, and there are shorthand versions that are more palatable than others, right? Trying to get away from Mormon church. But it seems like they're showing that they're independent by not honoring the requests of the church for how it should be referenced. And other news organizations outside Utah are doing better than they are. So I'm a little annoyed by that, but they get a lot of their traffic, a lot of their comments is coverage about the church. And so they're filling an interesting niche there and getting whatever kind of donations and traffic that they're getting to that kind of content.
Well, I think it's clear that they're struggling to figure out a revenue model. When I was there, it's all we talked about.
Yeah.
Is how do you fund this thing? What do you do? I think we started subscriptions. I don't think subscriptions work at a local level, by the way. How do you feel about that? Because Deseret News, you don't do subscriptions.
That's right. We don't have a paywall. It's something that we look at about every 8 to 12 months to see if it's a model that would work for us. The New York Times is the international standard. They've done a fantastic job. They got a lot during the Trump bump. They've got a lot of revenue coming in. They're very successful because they have a scale that works. Let's go back to classifieds for a second and just say that news, our argument is that news has never paid for itself, right? You can't actually sell enough advertising around the news on a printed page or now on a digital page or a mobile screen to pay for the cost of news production. So classifieds subsidize the cost of producing news. It's the same on KSL TV. They don't have enough revenue coming in from the ads that they run for a nightly news broadcast to pay for Chopper 5, the only local market that has a helicopter. No, you have to, it's Days of Our Lives and Saturday Night Live and kickbacks from other content agreements and organizations and advertising that subsidizes news. So in today's modern news environment, you either have to have a paywall, you have to take donations like The Guardian does. I mean, The Guardian's getting millions of dollars in donations from very small donors.
That long. It's longer than the article. They ask for the money.
Sometimes is. That's right. Yeah. Or you have to subsidize with other businesses. And it's some combination of those that you've got to find the exact right model. So we don't have a paywall right now. Again, we look at it every 12 months. And we're looking at it again to see if it's a viable fit for us.
I don't think it works locally. Now, you may be different in that you are global, which I want to talk about in the faith and family discussion, and the magazine is incredible, which I want to talk about. I think you produce a world-class magazine that certainly doesn't get enough credit because it's not just great for Utah, it's great for the, to the standards of the world, I think. But I don't think the subscription thing or, I don't think that works in a local market, right? If you think about it, so what if you got all Utahns to pay you, $7.95 a month or something like that? It's good. It's a good number. But again, like there's only 3.5 million people here. Like there's no like sustainability. Whereas like I feel like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times, they've figured it out. They're really good at it. Maybe The Economist too. Like, but I don't know anyone else who's done good other than those four.
Yeah, there are examples. I'll give two. The Boston Globe has done a fantastic job, and they charge almost $30 a month. But think about it, they're one of the most educated cities in America, the highest number of colleges per capita of any city in America, and they've got a very wealthy user base who can afford that $30 a month. But they're close to a peak right now. Newsday, which exists on Long Island in New York, has a very thriving subscription model, but they also have reached sort of the max of where they're going to go. So you have to take a combination of what can you do through advertising, what can you do through your print subscriptions, what can you do through digital subscriptions, and then you start doing things like, well, can we make money from YouTube videos or with syndication partnerships? And so you look beyond it, and every publisher, everybody who's in my seat at any news organization in the world, frankly, is figuring out what that right mix is, because things are changing. We're seeing a lot less traffic to news from Facebook. I mean, Facebook used to call it the news feed.
Yeah.
And I know you're not on there, you just said, but some people still go to Facebook. They're seeing a lot less news content.
Most of the world does. It's still the dominant.
So,
I think
we've seen it decrease. You've got changes to algorithms at Google search and generative AI results that are coming now. That's a threat to us. So one of the things that news organizations have to do is start concentrating less on algorithms and external big tech driving traffic to creating user habits and creating loyalty and front door traffic. KSL.com has done a fantastic job of that. In fact, I think they're probably a higher percentage of homepage visits than any other news organization, maybe in the country. It's certainly local news organizations. We've been more reliant on that side door traffic, and so we're playing catch up a little bit to try to increase the number of people who say, what does Deseret think about that? I better go check out the homepage today, or I had to see what's in the latest issue of the magazine.
My opinion on that is probably quite a bit different. I understand you got to make money, but also like the reason why the Deseret News is so special is they don't play those games. That's kind of how I feel about it. And the magazine doesn't play that game. Like you don't have to play that game. So if you don't have to play it, why not just build the community? Like I understand like we're in business and all we think about every day is how we grow and get bigger and bigger. But man, there's such a need for a voice that just cuts through all that bull crap and like doesn't even worry about. And it like there's just says, there's something special about like, I'm not playing that game. And we're actually just gonna do our own thing. We're gonna build our own community here. And it seems like counterintuitively that gets you more growth and all that type of stuff anyways, right? Because you are doing something different, which is so needed. Like, okay, let me ask you a few things that I've always, I think I asked Doug Wilkes this once and he got mad at me because he thought it was such a stupid question, and maybe it is. But why do editorial boards exist in 2024?
That's a great question. Why do you think they shouldn't exist?
What is the point of that?
Yeah.
Here, I'll give you my case for maybe why they shouldn't exist.
And do you mean like editorials themselves? Like why are newspapers weighing in on things with an unvoiced opinion?
Endorsements I hate.
Yeah.
Endorsements by newspaper. I've always hated that. Even more so now. I think it only hurts you as a newspaper too. Like why are you doing that? One of the things I loved about the Salt Lake Tribune going and becoming a 501c3 nonprofit is it couldn't do that anymore. It's like, oh, great. That's one less thing we have to worry about. But they still have editorial boards and it's still very clear who they support and who they don't and all that type of stuff. Like this whole idea of like an editorial, like a candidate meeting with an editorial board and like, you know, them asking questions and then that's like presented to us, the rest of the public through an editorial board. But I guess I probably don't care about the candidate thing. I actually think maybe there's a place for that. Maybe not the editorial board, but just like them meeting with reporters. and answering those questions rather than like this editorial board. But the editorial board is such an interesting thing because it's just an opinion from the people who run it, right? Like I don't get it. I don't get why it exists when we have Twitter and Facebook and all these. I understand why it existed in the past, but you don't really need opinion or editorial in news anymore is like my current thinking, but tell me why I'm wrong. Cause Doug thought I was dead wrong.
I don't know. Actually, I don't know that you are wrong. There's probably a middle ground between you and Doug. Doug, of course, is executive editor of the Deseret News and my dear friend and colleague. So go back to print days. You open the paper. One side is the opinion of the Deseret News, right? And on the other side are op-eds opposite the editorial.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when people are writing in sort of firsthand one-off columns to say, not just, they're beyond letters to the editor. It's somebody developing an idea a little bit further. We still run opinion pieces. One of the biggest problems we have, Clint, is that you have a generation of readers who weren't exposed to what I just showed you, the editorial and op-eds. And they'll get mad when they're seeing opinions because they think all news should be objective. But why are we seeing this opinion stuff? So we've got a little bit of work to do in terms of a basic understanding of what news is and what content types are and what that means. But I think it is helpful when people come in and meet with the editorial board, not because we're going to write opinion pieces about it, because you get a briefing and understand the candidates. We've had national candidates for president come in and meet with the Deseret News editorial board. We've had obviously local candidates. We had some school board representatives come in a couple of weeks ago. I don't attend those meetings anymore, but I was on that board for a number of years. And it's helpful to go deep, sometimes to go on background or speak off the record about things that are really happening that helps us shape not just editorials, but coverage overall. So it's a good exchange, like the exchange that we're having right now. But I'll tell you this, just from a numbers perspective, when we were publishing a daily Deseret News opinion piece from the Deseret News, that wasn't hitting with users, right? Readers weren't saying, I can't wait to see what the Deseret News weighs in on this. Certain subset of people, the governor's office, local legislature, our congressional delegation back in DC, they were looking at those things, but not a lot of other users were. So as we've expanded our knowledge base on what's working online, we've actually reduced the number of editorials that we're writing from the Deseret News. And maybe someday we'll get outside of that, but I think it's helpful for us sometimes to just declare what we think from an opinion perspective is going on in society, or warning people that this legislation could have these unintended consequences. So you may not be compelled by that, but I think it's still an important part of what we're doing.
I do think it's good for the public to understand the point of view of the people who are publishing the paper. I do think but every week or every day, I don't think that's important, right? Like I think the work and the words and when you weigh in hold so much more weight when you do it rarely.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because it probably is something that needs to be done rarely. I'll give you an example. And this is, so from my Salt Lake Tribune days, when I was in the board of the Salt Lake Tribune, Pat Bagley, the cartoonist, did something that compared police officers to the KKK. There was like some cartoon about like a hood or something. I can't remember exactly what it looked like. And there was obviously all this uproar and stuff, right? And so we had like this emergency board meeting about what we were going to do about Pat Bagley, knowing nobody was going to do anything. So we get on this like Zoom because it's during COVID, so we couldn't meet with each other. And we're all like going back and forth. And like most of the board was like, hey, that's Pat. That's not the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm like, so where do we publish it? Oh, in the Salt Lake Tribune. On saltlaketribune.com. Who pays him? Oh, the Salt Lake Tribune. Why do we think we're not tied to this guy? Like the argument really was like, we're not tied to this guy. That is Pat's opinion and he has every right to express it. And I'm like, yes, but do we have to pay him to do that? And this is like, and again, I don't know that I cared whether he stayed or gone. It was a foregone conclusion that he was staying anyways, right? Like there was no way.
Yeah.
Because he brings so much traffic and all that type of stuff. And it's just, probably an institution over there at this point. But the argument was so interesting. That was probably one of the more interesting calls of my life, actually, where they were like, hey, no, this is Pat. Pat can publish whatever he wants. It doesn't represent the Salt Lake Tribune. And the whole time I just kept saying, so we publish it on the Salt Lake Tribune's website, in the Salt Lake Tribune paper, and we pay Pat to produce it. How are we also not responsible for it?
You had a lot of fun on that board.
Oh, well then, a bunch of us resigned. That's kind of the end of that story. But because it just doesn't make any sense. It'll never make sense to me. And when they publish like these, that's an extreme example, right? Of somebody like they pay. But then when newspapers and the Tribune specifically, they would publish these letters, right? And then they tweet out just letters from people. And like, no one knows their parlance. I don't know how, like, the whole time I was on that board, I'm all, no one knows what you're talking about. Right. Op-ed, editorial, they see Salt Lake Tribune, they think it's from you. They probably don't even care about who the author is. It's like Salt Lake Tribune, this piece represents the Salt Lake Tribune's opinion. So when you're tweeting out these opinion pieces of like somebody just randomly, and they're all like one-sided and kind of crazy, everyone's just like, well, that's the opinion of the Salt Lake Tribune. They don't like dig any deeper than that. It seemed like, and that never got through ever. It was the craziest thing.
It's something we're still wrestling with, right? The Washington Post, their new publisher, has a really interesting notion that you need 3 newsrooms, and I don't know if every reader is going to understand this. But you have the objective newsroom that's reporting on the news of the day. You have your opinion newsroom that's both seeking opinions from outside entities and doing internal opinions locally. And then you have a third one, which is how do we take the content that both of these have produced and put it into formats that people will consume? You talked about not paying attention to TV or radio. A lot of people don't. A lot of people don't subscribe to the newspaper. I can tell you that number is one that's going, down and to the right. The number one reason for years that we've lost newspaper subscribers is death. Right? Mm-hmm. Somebody dies and their kids are like, this newspaper's still showing up. How do we stop this from happening? Right? We don't need this anymore.
And it's always really hard, not for the Deseret News, but it's really hard to cancel your subscription.
It can be hard.
Even for like the Wall Street Journal, it's nuts.
It's a little bit tricky. But there are formats that are more palatable to emerging and younger audiences. And how do you repackage that? Today, I read this morning, 17% of US adults are starting to rely on TikTok for news. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. And, we may have questions about that company, about its viability in the US is up for debate right now. But the algorithms that drive news is tricky. I would prefer that people were intentional with their news media diet, right? For anybody who are watching calories or paying attention to labels on things that we consume, you're aware of the fact that what you're bringing into your body has an impact. And I would argue that what we bring into our minds and hearts has an impact on how we see the world. So I would vote for people being intentional. What am I going to take into me today? And I wouldn't say choose a single source and say that's the be all and end all of truth. I'd say I'm going to read this news organization, which I believe is on the political left, and I'm going to read this one on the political right. And I will subscribe to these newsletters or follow these people on these social channels because I want to get a well-balanced media diet. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important. I wouldn't tell anybody the only news resource that you should consult is the Deseret News or Deseret Magazine. Yeah. It's not adequate because we're not covering everything. And some people do some things differently or better than we do in the various areas, but you'll be more informed and have a better sense of what you feel you want to do, whether you're looking at financial decisions, at political decisions, looking at where you're going to live, live in Utah, by the way. Mm-hmm. But all those decisions will be better informed if you're intentional about the media that you take in and don't rely on TikTok or Meta or Google's algorithms for happenstantially, that's a word, delivering something to you in between other things that you're flipping through and scrolling through.
I guess my thing is like, because I like columnists. Mm-hmm. I think columnists are really interesting. And I think that's great. And I think opinion is like, I guess my point is like opinion has already been, you've already lost that war if you are a newspaper, right? And so what makes you unique? Because anybody can spout their opinion perfectly well on Twitter, Substack. Like if you're really good at it, you're going to have a Substack, you're going to have all these like various things, right? Like it's really easy for me to understand people's opinions of things. What makes news organizations unique for me is what they can do that those people, that a Substack written by one person can't do, which is kind of like the deeper. And so I wonder how often you think about like quality over quantity. Because I know like quantity is like this huge, used to be like, hey, you got to publish 5 to 10 articles a day, all this type of stuff if you were in that business. Yeah. I wonder how you've thought about that now. And like, actually, if we just because most of those articles are probably being published elsewhere. I have a whole thing with like syndicating the AP, by the way, which is a whole different thing. Like, why not just focus on like your resources on like the things that are really going to make you stand out? And so, yeah, what do you think about that piece where its quality might be better than quantity, but then obviously you're going to lose traffic doing that. Yeah. So there's this interesting thing.
That's a good play. There's something we're learning from the tech industry right now. This started from the BBC back in 2016, 17. They started addressing user needs. So instead of just following a beat, there are a variety of ways that you can write a piece of content that addresses actually how users want to engage with content. And that takes a certain amount of quantitative proficiency, but also empathy for how are people going to consume this. News organizations that have implemented this model, and we're just learning about it. European news orgs are all over this already. We're just starting to look at this at the Deseret News. They've actually been able to go down in the number of articles that they publish every day and have better returns.
Yeah.
Both in terms of people spending time on their articles and for news organizations that have paywalls, getting people to pull out their wallets and actually pay for something. Why? Because there is something about quality versus quantity.
And it's something you can only find there.
Yeah.
Only they're doing it.
Yep.
Right?
When you're playing the quantity game, you're actually playing craps, right? You're hoping that, I don't know much about craps. I don't know anything about craps, actually.
I'm sure it's like craps.
I've heard of a crapshoot, right?
I don't know anything
it's the
about
idea that you're just trying a bunch of stuff. I know about pasta. You're throwing a lot of noodles at the wall and hoping that some of them stick. And we've had a certain amount of success with that, but the content that we've produced isn't always things that is going to, get us awards or recognition or really meet the needs of our audience. So I think in the future, you'll see us come down a little bit in terms of the number of articles that we're producing every day and playing a little bit more of that quality game you're talking about.
Well, you do that with the magazine. So tell me the whole premise behind starting this magazine. And by the way, you're getting world-class writers. You're obviously sinking a lot. It's beautifully produced. You're sinking a lot of money into it. Like, it really is just this incredible magazine. What was the idea behind that?
This was something that we had thought about for a long time. And it was drawing a line in the sand and making a pivot. When we went away from the daily newspaper, again, in a portfolio view, we didn't have to do what KSL was doing and successful at already. We could do something different. So the magazine was both a mechanism for reaching a different audience and for training ourselves how to speak to that audience. So it really is about national issues. Again, grounded in Utah. We're not trying to be outside. We're not trying to be what we're not. There's a great professor of journalism at New York University named Jay Rosen. And he says we're beyond the idea of the view from nowhere, that we don't have any point of view. No, we have a point of view. It's located here in the Beehive State. It's centered in Salt Lake City. It's informed by our ownership. And that's who we are. And that magazine is this point of view. It's almost a voice from the West to the rest, if you will. And so we're having great success with that. Like you said, also when you print a magazine, it turns out it's a draw to get bigger name people to submit articles or to agree to write for you.
Yeah.
Yuval Levine, Arthur Brooks, even one of my favorite media people right now is Barry Weiss.
Yeah.
She wrote for us even before she started her sort of burgeoning media enterprise. It's been very successful in terms that we've won design awards. It's something we're really proud of. And in a sense, it's our very best marketing tool when we're meeting with people nationally and internationally to say, let me show you what we're about, what we're doing. And then they also then see us more than a podunk news organization from the frontier of America. Yeah. They see us as, I think, the journalism, the kind of journalism that we're aspiring to produce.
Well, it's very thoughtful. It's very well produced. It's obviously taken a lot of time, which is like the opposite of all the other stuff, right? It's incredible. I read it every time it comes out. I'm super excited when it comes out. All right, I have two more topics for you. We're going to talk about AI last.
Okay.
Video. Deseret News. I don't see them in video a lot.
Yeah, we have tried. Our most successful video to date was when I had a small video team a few years ago, and we went on location in Idaho to where Napoleon Dynamite was filmed and sort of recreated some of the moments. It's kind of a cute video, little video. It's over 1 million views, but we've really struggled to hit our stride with video and building the right video team. So we're rebuilding right now. we know it's something that we're missing out on, and something that we're committed to figuring out. So you'll see more video from the Deseret News soon. And if we also produce it based on these user needs I'm talking about, it won't just be ethereal, top shelf, buttoned up journalism. It's going to speak to audiences where they are. And I think it'll be maybe even a new voice for the Deseret News.
Yeah, I see that as a huge opportunity. It's like going out there, like they don't have to be long produced. You don't have to have a guy in a studio, like go out and just talk to people. And I think people would think it's really interesting. I see that obviously you do too, as a huge growth opportunity for you guys. All right, finally, AI. What are the odds like none of this even matters 10 years from now?
It's a great question, and one that we spend a lot of time thinking about. I serve on the board of the News Media Alliance, which is the largest trade association for newspaper and magazine publishers. And I was just in DC a week and a half ago lobbying members of Congress for legislation that would be helpful to our business. Part of the problem there is that big tech has had all of the cards for a long, long time. But they've relied on and built their businesses. Facebook reached a certain extent when it was just on college campuses, but it really took off when it became a news source for people, right? Google, between 17 and 50% of returns on a Google search are to news organizations. And then they started taking the content from our sites without our permission and creating snippets up at the top of the page, which gave us no credit and no remuneration and kept people in the Google ecosystem longer. So we think already that we have a case to be made that big tech owes journalism some money. Other countries have passed legislation and paid out, and Google and Facebook have paid out tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars around the world, knowing that they've gotten something somewhat illicitly without remuneration.
Absolutely. There's no question that's true.
And AI is blowing that up. All of the models are trained on news. And the success of models going forward will be answering people's questions about today. So there's a great user need. If I go to a Google Gemini page or some of the beta tests that have come out, it turns out most people actually just want answers to their questions. They don't necessarily want to go to Deseret.com and read 1,200 words to get the answer to their question. So there's a great user need there. The challenge with that is, again, they've trained their AIs on our content without any consideration for us.
Without your permission.
Without our permission.
Which to me is illegal.
Sure. And then Google has the audacity to then sell a product back to Newsroom that says, hey, we can help you produce content faster. You're like, great. How did you train that model? Oh, we don't want to talk about that. Right? And they don't.
Yeah, they're literally stealing your content and your IP.
Yeah.
Because really what it is, it's an IP issue and you own that. It's I actually don't get how so many media companies just seeded. I remember when people were like, hey, we're partnering with Facebook and we're going to start publishing all of our articles on Facebook. I'm like, what are you talking about? That's just like a growth strategy, like a third quarter growth strategy for Facebook that will go away the next quarter because what do they care? Like, this is nuts. Stop doing that. So
what are they doing right now? They're relying on, look, the New York Times is suing. A few other people have joined that lawsuit. Others of us are lobbying for legislation. Perplexity is saying that they're going to make deals with individual news publishers. We're sort of waiting to see what happens. But the truth is, I think most of them are relying on, they're trying to get market share. They don't care. They'll pay out later. They'll have lawyers handle it and do whatever settlements that they need to make later on. I don't like the model, but I certainly understand it from their shoes. As a news publisher, again, this means I've got to get people coming in through the front door, subscribing to our newsletters. Even frankly, a YouTube strategy or a TikTok strategy is still just playing the game that we've been losing for the last 25 years.
It is.
Right?
Absolutely.
We've got to figure out a direct strategy. And if we don't, then what will happen is the worst end of all of this is that big tech, big AI wins and our brands are erased and we're content contributors to big tech.
Yeah.
And that easily could happen. I'm hoping that it doesn't because I think it's important to be informed about the sources and make decisions and understand who it was that was producing the content that you're seeing.
By the way, news orgs are like the behemoths of that example, but even just regular people are doing that, which I'll never understand why we just let all of this happen because we've become customers to, like 6 or 7 billionaires. We just become like, we work for them. We like work for Zuck or Elon or, all these people. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Even LinkedIn this last week, I'm sure you saw these posts. They're training their AI on things that people write on LinkedIn. and they automatically opted you in. And if you opt out, it's only from that point forward. They can take anything that you've invested on LinkedIn in the past,
Absolutely.
train their AI. Now, I don't know what the outcome of that's going to be, but they're not going to remunerate us for what we produced for them.
Well, here's my other question about AI is like, how are you using it in the newsroom for news production? Because it will be a point where it will be able to cover, the basic, this happened at this place, here are all the facts types of things. You won't need that from a human soon.
That's
Maybe not already, I don't know, but soon you won't need that. And so how are you thinking about it from like a news production standpoint?
So my frustrations with big tech aside, I'm really enthusiastic about the use of AI in newsrooms. We're using it right now in a variety of ways to come up with headline ideas. It's actually really good at coming up with interview questions when you're going to talk to somebody or getting deep background on somebody. And it's better, obviously, if your model, your LLM has more recent data. But we're using it for, to help us with SEO and other things that maybe not all of our journalists got really, really good at, but it turns out AI is pretty good at that. We're not using, we're actually using it in one place right now to produce content, and that's in box scores for high school sports. A box score can be turned into a narrative by AI that just gives a couple paragraphs if somebody wants to read that.
Game recaps.
Yeah.
There's going to be no need for a human to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's where it makes sense to use it, we should use it. I was in an invite-only conference in Vail a few weeks ago with publishers from around the world. There were 50 of us there. 19 were from the US. The rest were from all over the world. And one of the things that they have found, particularly in Europe, is that people don't care if content's produced by AI as long as it's disclosed. And as long as there's utility there. AI won't be able to get scoops, I don't think. It might help us find scoops, right? Go through large data sets and figure out where people have been misspending our money, going through their, digital garbage cans versus their physical garbage cans to find out, hold large government organizations accountable and businesses accountable. I think AI will probably take facts that we produce in the future and help us go faster than we have. The question is one of reliability and disclosure. And all news organizations are sort of wrestling with this right now. What's our ethical policy? How far are we going to go? How quickly? And ultimately, how do we meet user needs and how does it affect our business model? I don't want to lay off I don't want to replace any of our journalists with AI. I don't think we should, but I do think that we ought to be able to produce more relevant content and sometimes more content in areas that we're not covering with AI. So the common refrain now that I really like is you won't be replaced by AI, but you'll be replaced by somebody who uses it. And I think that'll be true for journalists as well.
And I think if the use of AI, they're using it in a very responsible, ethical way, it only make them better at their jobs. Like there's no way it's not worse. And again, like the journalist, the whole point is you pick up a phone or you go and talk to someone and AI is never going to replace that. Right. Or you follow leads and you follow like these recap things. That's not really journalism as much as like, this is what happened. Right. Burke, thank you so much.
Clint, thank you.
Seriously, that was fun. I could talk to you forever.
Likewise.